Rachel never planned to see her grandmother again. After all, Eleanor had nothing left. At least, that's what everyone believed until the letter arrived. She still owns everything. A lost inheritance, a betrayal buried in lies, and a family secret too dangerous to ignore. Rachel must uncover the truth before it's too late. Eleanor Brooks once had everything: wealth, power, and a family she believed she could trust. But in her final years, she was left abandoned in a nursing home, stripped of everything she built. Her own son, David Carter, had orchestrated it all. For years, no one questioned what had happened. Her fortune vanished, her existence forgotten. But when her estranged granddaughter, Rachel Miller, receives an anonymous letter revealing a shocking family secret, she embarks on a journey that will change everything. The truth is darker than she imagined. David didn't just steal from Eleanor, he erased her from history. But with undeniable proof in her hands, Rachel faces an impossible choice: expose the truth and risk everything, or walk away and let a lie remain unchallenged. Rachel Miller never wanted to look back. Her past was filled with wounds she had spent years trying to forget. The Brooks name carried weight, but for her, it only brought pain, abandonment, deception, and a family that always put money above love. For years, she had convinced herself that some things were better left buried, that walking away was the only way to survive. But then the letter arrived. It was left under her door, plain and unmarked. Inside, a single line: "Your grandmother still owns everything." Rachel stared at the words, her heartbeat loud in her ears. It didn't make sense. Eleanor had lost everything years ago: her fortune, her home, her dignity. David had made sure of that, hadn't he? Her fingers tightened around the paper as a thought she didn't want to entertain crept into her mind. What if everything she had been told was a lie? She pulled out her laptop, her hands trembling as she typed Eleanor's name into a public records search. Her breath caught in her throat. Eleanor Brooks was still listed as the owner of the Brooks estate. Rachel's stomach twisted. If her grandmother had never signed her fortune away, then how had David taken it? And if someone had sent this letter to her, it meant she wasn't the only one asking questions. There was only one person who could give her the answers she needed. And for the first time in years, Rachel knew exactly where she had to go. Rachel gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. The letter sat on the passenger seat, a silent challenge. She had spent years running from the Brooks family, but now the past had come knocking. The nursing home loomed ahead, its brick facade cold and uninviting. She hadn't seen Eleanor in years. What would she find? A fragile old woman lost in memories? Or someone who still had fight left in her? Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside. The smell of antiseptic and faded time filled the air. Residents sat in silence, their gazes distant, their worlds shrunken to the four walls around them. A nurse glanced up. "Can I help you?" Rachel swallowed hard. "I'm here to see Eleanor Brooks." Something flickered across the woman's face. Surprise? Pity? Rachel couldn't tell. She doesn't get many visitors. The words stung more than they should have. Rachel had been part of that silence. She had let her grandmother disappear from her life without question. She followed the nurse down the hall, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then finally, there she was. Eleanor sat by a window, thin and pale, but her eyes, those piercing blue eyes, still burned with something Rachel couldn't quite name. And in that moment, Rachel knew. Her grandmother had been waiting for her. Rachel hesitated, standing at the edge of the room. She expected frailty, confusion, maybe even bitterness. But Eleanor Brooks only stared, her sharp blue eyes studying her like she was a puzzle missing its final piece. "Rachel." Her voice was soft but steady, not the voice of a woman broken by time. Rachel's throat tightened. How long had it been? 5 years? More? Guilt settled heavy in her chest. She had let Eleanor fade into the past, believing there was nothing left to save. She took a slow step forward. "Hi, Grandma." The words felt foreign, like something borrowed from a childhood she barely remembered. Eleanor tilted her head. "You look like your mother." The statement was simple, but Rachel felt its weight. Her mother, Another wound neither of them wanted to reopen. She cleared her throat, pushing forward. I got a letter. She placed the envelope on Eleanor's lap, watching as her grandmother traced the edges with thin, trembling fingers. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, with a bitter chuckle, she murmured, "Took you long enough." Rachel's pulse quickened. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't dementia. Eleanor knew exactly why she was here, and she had been waiting. Rachel pulled a chair closer, her fingers tightening around the edges of her jacket. Eleanor's words hung heavy in the air. Took you long enough. The old woman ran a frail hand over the envelope, then looked up. What do you think you found, Rachel? Her voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it. A test. Rachel hesitated. I think my father stole everything from you. Saying it out loud felt dangerous, like stepping onto a bridge that might collapse beneath her. Eleanor exhaled, her gaze drifting to the window. Your father always wanted control. A small, bitter smile crossed her lips. I just never thought he'd go this far. Rachel's chest tightened. Then it's true. Eleanor nodded slowly. I never signed anything, Rachel. One day the house was mine. The next it wasn't. Her fingers clenched against the thin fabric of her blanket. He didn't just take my fortune. He erased me. Rachel swallowed hard. Her father hadn't just stolen money, he had rewritten history. And now, Rachel was the only one who could bring the truth back to light. Rachel's mind raced. Her father hadn't just manipulated Eleanor. He had erased her. But if Eleanor never signed anything, then how did David take legal ownership? She leaned in. Grandma, do you remember anything about the documents? Did you ever see them? Eleanor sighed, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her chair. David came one day with papers. He told me not to worry, said it was just for my care. Her lips pressed together. But I refused. I never signed. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Then how did he do it? Eleanor's expression darkened. He had help. Rachel straightened. Help. That meant there were people who knew what had happened, a lawyer, a notary, someone who could confirm the fraud. Do you remember a name? Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor's gaze met hers, unwavering. Charles Whitman. Rachel's stomach twisted. She knew that name. Her father's longtime lawyer, the man who had handled every Brooks family affair. And if anyone could tell Rachel how David pulled this off, it was him. Rachel's pulse quickened. Charles Whitman. The name brought back memories of whispered conversations, closed doors, and her father's careful manipulations. If David had stolen Eleanor's fortune, Whitman was the one who made it possible. She pulled out her phone and searched his name. The law firm still existed, and Whitman, he was still practicing. That meant records, documents, proof. Eleanor watched her closely. He won't talk easily, she murmured. He's been cleaning up your father's messes for years. Rachel exhaled sharply. Then I'll make him talk. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You have more of your mother in you than I thought. Rachel stood, tucking the letter into her bag. Her next step was clear, but as she turned to leave, Eleanor's frail hand grasped hers. Be careful, she whispered. David doesn't like loose ends. Rachel nodded, but inside, a cold certainty settled in her chest. She had just put herself on her father's radar, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Rachel parked outside the Whitman and Associates office, gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't just any law firm. This was where her father's lies had been legitimized. She stepped inside, the air thick with the sterile scent of polished wood and old money. A receptionist looked up, her expression neutral. Do you have an appointment? Rachel forced a smile. Tell Mr. Whitman that Eleanor Brooks' granddaughter is here. Minutes passed. Too long. The kind of delay meant to make people leave. But Rachel sat firm, staring at the frosted glass door until it finally creaked open. Charles Whitman stood in the doorway, older, thinner, but with the same calculating eyes she remembered. Rachel Miller, he murmured, studying her. I was wondering when you'd show up. Her stomach twisted. So he had been expecting her. Rachel followed him inside, heart pounding. If he already knew why she was here, that meant he had something to hide. And she wasn't leaving until she found out what. Rachel sat across from Charles Whitman, the dim office heavy with unspoken truths. The man who had helped her father steal everything now sat before her, calm, unreadable. "You knew I'd come," she said, folding her arms. "No point in pretending." Whitman exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against his desk. "I did, but I hoped you wouldn't." Rachel leaned in. Eleanor never signed those papers. A flicker of something, guilt, caution, crossed his face before he masked it. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rachel pulled the letter from her bag, placing it between them. "This says otherwise." Whitman's jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw fear. Rachel's pulse quickened. She had him cornered. Now she just had to make him talk. Whitman stared at the letter, his jaw tight. Rachel could see the conflict in his eyes, loyalty versus self-preservation. "You helped him forge the documents," she pressed. "Did you really think no one would find out?" Whitman exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand, Rachel. Your father, he doesn't leave loose ends." Her stomach twisted. "That sounds like a threat." He shook his head. "It's a warning. I drew up the paperwork, yes, but David made sure there was no trace left. No signatures, no originals. Just what the court saw." Rachel's blood ran cold. Her father had erased every piece of evidence. But then Whitman hesitated, a flicker of doubt. "Unless..." Rachel leaned forward. "Unless what?" Whitman swallowed hard. "If anything still exists, it would be in the bank. A safety deposit box." Rachel's pulse quickened. She finally had a lead. But now, so did David. Rachel stepped out of the law office, her heart pounding. A safety deposit box. If Whitman was right, that was where the last shred of evidence remained. She pulled out her phone, searching for the nearest branch of the bank Eleanor used. She had to move fast. If she had this information, David would have it soon too. A cold breeze sent a shiver down her spine. Her instincts screamed that she was being watched. She glanced around, but the street was empty. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. Sliding into her car, she started the engine. But her phone buzzed before she could pull away. A blocked number. A single message. "Turn back, Rachel. Last warning." Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. David knew. And now the real game had begun. Rachel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The message was a warning, but also a challenge. If David thought she would back down now, he didn't know her at all. She sped toward the bank, her mind racing. A safety deposit box meant proof. Documents. Something her father hadn't been able to erase. But how long before he got there first? As she parked, her pulse quickened. A black car was idling across the street, its tinted windows unreadable. The same uneasy feeling from before crept up her spine. She walked inside, keeping her pace steady. The bank's air conditioning was too cold, the silence too heavy. A clerk looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" Rachel slid Eleanor's account number across the counter. "I need access to this safety deposit box. Now." The clerk hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. Then, she nodded. "Of course. Right this way." Rachel followed her, but her heart pounded with a single thought. Was she already too late? Rachel followed the clerk through a narrow hallway, her breath shallow. Each step felt heavier, as if she were walking straight into a trap. The woman stopped in front of a thick steel door. "Please wait here." She turned the key, and the heavy door creaked open. Rachel stepped inside. Rows of metal boxes lined the walls, silent witnesses to decades of secrets. The clerk gestured to one near the center. "Box 317. Take your time." Rachel slid the key into the lock. Her hands trembled. She turned it and the latch clicked open. Inside, she found a thick envelope, yellowed with age but intact. Heart pounding, she pulled it out, flipping it open. Her breath caught. Inside were copies of original ownership documents, Eleanor's untouched signature standing in stark contrast to the forgeries. Bank transfers, estate records, The proof David had tried to erase. Rachel exhaled sharply. This was it. The key to everything. Then, behind her, a noise. A shadow loomed in the doorway. She wasn't alone. Rachel's fingers clenched around the envelope. She had the proof, but now she had to get out. The shadow in the doorway stepped forward. A tall man in a dark suit. His stance too rigid to be just another customer. "Miss Miller," he said smoothly, "that box belongs to the Brooks family. I'll take those documents now." Rachel's heart pounded. "I don't think so." She shoved the papers into her bag and took a step back. The man sighed. "You don't understand who you're up against. Walk away now, and this stays quiet." Rachel's mind raced. If he was here, David already knew what she had found. She glanced at the exit too far. The only way out was through him. Her fingers brushed against her phone in her pocket. One call, one chance, and then she ran. Rachel bolted down the hallway, her pulse pounding. Footsteps thundered behind her. Too fast, too close. She burst into the lobby, shoving past startled customers. "Stop her!" the man shouted, but no one moved. The exit was just ahead. 10 feet. 5. Then, a hand clamped around her wrist. Rachel twisted violently, her bag slipping. The envelope tumbled out, papers scattering across the marble floor. A moment of hesitation. The man lunged for the documents. Rachel reacted on instinct. She kicked them away, sending pages flying beneath the bank's security desk. A guard stepped forward, confused. "What's going on here?" The man froze. Too public. Too many eyes. Rachel didn't wait. She grabbed what she could and sprinted out the door. She had escaped for now. But David wouldn't let this go. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps as she darted through the crowded street, her pulse hammering in her ears. She clutched the crumpled papers against her chest, her mind racing. She needed a plan. Fast. She spotted a narrow alleyway between two buildings and slipped inside, pressing her back against the cold brick wall. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked from the struggle, but it still worked. She had one chance. Mark Reynolds. Her fingers hovered over the call button. Mark was an investigative journalist, one of the few who had ever gone against men like David and lived to tell the story. He had exposed corporate fraud, political scandals, and now maybe he could help her. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Rachel? Do you have something for me?" Rachel swallowed hard. "I have proof. My father stole everything from Eleanor, and he's trying to bury it." Again. A long pause. Then Mark's tone sharpened. "Where are you?" Rachel peeked around the alley's edge. The black car from the bank was parked at the curb. The man inside scanned the street, phone pressed to his ear. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't just running from the truth anymore. She was running for her life. She ducked back and whispered into the phone. "I don't know how much time I have, but I need your help." Mark's voice was firm. "Get to my office. Now." Rachel clenched her jaw. The game had changed. She wasn't just uncovering a secret. She was in the middle of a war, and her father had just made his next move. Rachel kept her head down as she weaved through the crowd, gripping the documents tightly. Every face around her felt like a potential threat. The black car from the bank hadn't moved, but she knew better than to assume she had lost them. David wasn't the type to let go easily. Her heartbeat pounded as she spotted a cab at the corner. She rushed toward it, glancing over her shoulder. The man from the bank was still scanning the street, his phone pressed to his ear. Was he calling David? Sending someone after her? She yanked the taxi door open and slid inside. "Go. Now." The driver, an older man with tired eyes, raised an eyebrow but pulled away from the curb. Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched the papers in her lap. Mark's office wasn't far, but every red light, every slow turn, felt like a countdown. If David knew she had these documents, what was he willing to do to stop her? Her phone buzzed. A new message. No name. Just 5 words. "You should have stayed quiet." Rachel's breath caught. Her grip tightened on the papers. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about survival. The cab turned the final corner. Mark's office was just ahead. A small, unmarked building tucked between two high-rises. Safe, or so she thought. As the cab pulled to a stop, a second black car was already parked outside, waiting for her. Rachel's breath hitched as she stared at the black car parked in front of Mark's office. They were already here, waiting. She knew running wasn't an option. If they wanted to stop her, they would. She had come too far to turn back now. Swallowing her fear, she stepped out of the cab, clutching the envelope. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she forced herself forward. The front door to Mark's office was slightly open. Had they gotten to him first? She stepped inside. Dim light, the smell of old paper and burnt coffee. Silence. Then movement. A figure in the corner. Rachel tensed. Mark Reynolds turned, his expression unreadable. "You weren't followed, were you?" Rachel exhaled sharply. "They were here before me." She handed him the documents. "This is everything. My father stole her entire fortune." Mark flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "This is big, Rachel. But if we go public with this..." He hesitated. "David won't let it slide." Rachel set her jaw. "I don't care." Mark nodded slowly. "Then let's finish this." But outside, in the darkened car, a pair of cold eyes watched, and David Carter was already preparing his next move. Rachel barely had time to process Mark's words before the office phone rang, slicing through the tense silence. Mark exchanged a glance with her before answering. His expression darkened. "It's for you." Rachel hesitated, then took the receiver. A cold, familiar voice filled the line. "You've made a mistake, Rachel." Her stomach twisted. "David." His tone was calm, almost amused. "You think handing those papers to a washed-up journalist is going to change anything?" A pause. "Come home. Let's talk." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not afraid of you." David chuckled. "Oh, but you should be." The line went dead. Mark was already moving, locking the doors, shutting the blinds. "You need to get out of here," he said. "Now." But it was too late. Outside, a black SUV pulled to a stop. Doors opened. Dark figures stepped onto the sidewalk. David wasn't just calling. He had come to end this himself. Rachel's pulse pounded as she stepped back from the window. David was here. He wasn't hiding behind lawyers or threats anymore. He had come to end this in person. Mark reached for a drawer, pulling out a small pistol. "We need to leave. Now." Rachel shook her head. "If I run, he wins." She had spent her whole life avoiding David's shadow. Not anymore. The office door rattled. A voice cold, smooth. "Rachel, open the door." Mark's grip tightened on the gun. Rachel squared her shoulders and reached for the handle. She opened the door. David stood there, impeccably dressed, eyes unreadable. Two men flanked him. Rachel forced herself to meet his gaze. "Let's talk," David said, stepping inside like he owned the place, like he still owned her. Rachel's hands curled into fists. "No, let's finish this." David sighed, as if disappointed. "You always were stubborn." He turned to Mark. "And you? Do you really think exposing this will change anything?" Mark's voice was steady. "It's already changed." He held up his phone. "This conversation? It's live." David's expression faltered. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Rachel's heart pounded. They had him, but David Carter wasn't a man who accepted defeat. Not without a fight. Silence filled the office. David's usual confidence wavered as he processed Mark's words. Live, broadcasting to thousands, maybe millions. Rachel didn't blink. "It's over, Dad." David's jaw clenched. For years, he had controlled every narrative, buried every loose end. But this? There was no escaping this. The office phone rang. Mark answered, listened, then smirked. "You might want to turn on the news." Rachel grabbed the remote. The screen flickered to life, news anchors discussing David Carter's fraudulent takeover of the Brooks fortune. Headlines flashed, corporate heir exposed in shocking family scandal. David exhaled slowly. "You think this will stop me?" Rachel met his gaze, unflinching. "I think your time is up." Sirens wailed in the distance. Mark crossed his arms. "Looks like they got the memo." David turned toward the door. Two uniformed officers entered, hands on their holsters. "David Carter," one of them said. "You're under arrest." Rachel watched as her father, the man who had built his empire on lies, was led away in handcuffs. The past had finally caught up with him. But for Rachel, this wasn't just about justice. It was about Eleanor, about the years that had been stolen. And now it was time to set things right. Days passed. The world moved on. But Rachel's life had changed forever. David Carter was behind bars, his empire crumbling. For the first time, the Brooks family name wasn't tied to deception, but to justice. Rachel walked through the nursing home doors, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the autumn leaves drift past. "How does it feel?" Rachel asked, sitting beside her. Eleanor smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Like I can breathe again." Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of legal documents. "Everything is yours again. The estate, the accounts. Every piece of your life he tried to steal." Eleanor took a deep breath, staring at the papers. "I don't need all this, Rachel." Rachel frowned. "It's your legacy." Eleanor turned to her. "No, child. You are." Tears burned Rachel's eyes. For years, she had believed she was alone. But here, in this moment, she knew family wasn't about blood. It was about the people who stood by you when everything else fell apart. As they sat together, the sun dipped below the horizon. A new chapter had begun, and this time it was theirs to write.